Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. And now I'm hoping that my listeners are anxious to continue with our discussion of the book, The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. Yesterday, we concluded with a discussion about the transition period between the pontificate of Pope Gregory XVI, the tyrant, that was so tyrannical it led to a rebellion in Italy, they wanting to separate the church from the state and to develop their own government, a popular constitutional form of government like we have here in the United States, and that of and having died during this dispute, Pope Pius IX came to the papal chair and had to dance, as it were, on the head of a pin, because he found himself caught between the Holy Alliance, the monarchs of Europe, together with the Jesuits on one side, and the revolutionists on the other. And the papacy had to do whatever it could to pacify both sides, and in the meantime, to maintain his temporal throne and his temporal power. The Pope could not give up his temporal power. To do so would have been a violation of Roman Catholic canon law, would have been a violation of the pseudo-Isidorian decretals. It would have been the destruction of the papacy. The papacy cannot survive unless it can function as a king, where it can dictate the policies of nations and use the state governments to defend the Pope's spiritual and temporal power. Now, Pope Gregory XVI is dead. Pope Pius IX is now in the papal chair, and to give the people a false hope that Pius IX might be a reformer, and that might, although he's not expected to allow the people to have their own constitutional governments, at least the hope is given out that he might ease up some of the tyranny, lighten up and give the people some liberties, whereas Pope Gregory XVI ruled with a rod of iron. They were hopeful that Pope Pius IX would reform. And in an attempt to give that vain hope to the people, Pope Pius IX issued an amnesty to political dissidents, those who had defended or sided, rather, with forming a constitutional government. He gave them amnesty that they could return to Italy so long as they swore in writing that they would honor the Pope's temporal authority. So it was all a pretense. It was all a pretense. The amnesty simply brought people back to Italy with the guarantee that they would accept the Pope's temporal power. And that being the case, you would naturally expect them to abandon any hope of forming a constitutional form of government. Now, because of this amnesty and the promise that every recipient of this amnesty must swear to uphold the temporal authority of the Pope, the author says at the beginning of the first full paragraph on page 295, he says, this meant, of course, the recognition of the old order of things, except insofar as Pope Pius IX, whose temporal authority as king was preserved, should think proper of his own accord to introduce reforms. So they had to acknowledge Pope Pius IX as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and that whatever reforms would come would have to come from him. Okay? He's maintaining his temporal power, his King of Kings status. So nothing has really changed. We're going back to the old world order. See, the new world order at that time was a democratic form of government, republican forms of government, constitutional forms of government, separation of church and state. But this Pope, pressured by the Jesuits, and Austria and the Holy Alliance, has to maintain his temporal power. You see, if he gives up any temporal power, then all the monarchs who shared that temporal power with the Pope and ruled at his behest, oppressing the people, they would lose their temporal power. And what would replace it would be these republican forms of government. So the stakes are high for the papacy and for the monarchs and for the Jesuits. Now, it was not understood to mean a continuance of the entire retrogressive policy of Gregory XVI, because underlying the fact of amnesty, the personality of Pope Pius IX and his supposed tendency toward liberalism had to be considered in interpreting it. That being the view taken of it, and this latter consideration having furnished the ground of hope in the future, the amnesty was generally accepted, and shoutings, rejoicings, and Te Deums were heard in all directions, in the provinces as well as at Rome. So the people see this amnesty as a step in the right direction, but they are under a false hope. And it says the only visible exception among the Italians were the extreme revolutionists who would be reconciled to nothing but the absolute destruction of the temporal power of the Pope by the separation of church and state and the formation of a constitutional government. So these are wild and woolly adherents to constitutional government. They're not fooled by this amnesty bit, and they know that there's only one way that they can be free, and that is to be free of the bonds of Rome. No longer did they want the iron feet of Rome to trample the clay. You see, this is Bible prophecy being fulfilled. The clay being the people who have rights, and especially Protestants who assert their right in Christ, and this iron boot in Rome, the beast. Okay? Excuse me. He said the only visible exception among the Italians were the extreme revolutionists. In other words, all but these extreme revolutionists had, as it were, withdrawn their swords, and they were willing to give this Pope a chance. Look, they had to decide, are we going to give this Pope a chance? If not, then we have to meet the Austrian guns. It's going to be a bloody civil war. It's going to be a bloody revolution. And everybody knows nobody wins in war except the Pope. Would to God that we had that much sense today. So they gave hope to this Pope. And it says, the only visible exception among the Italians were the extreme revolutionists who would be reconciled to nothing but the absolute destruction of the temporal power of the Pope by the separation of church and state and the formation of a constitutional government. They were not sufficiently numerous, however, to give direction to the general sentiment, and matters progressed with a seeming quietude which had not existed for a long time. They bore the appearance of there having been a reconciliation between the Pope and the great body of the American people. So for a temporal period of time, the Pope has won the confidence of the Italian people, except for these, what they would be called today, extremists. Okay? And it says this, however, soon proved to be merely an appearance. This is what you get when you negotiate with the historical, the biblical, and the prophetic Antichrist. It says, it only lulled the storm and put the winds at rest for a time. The amnesty left the temporal power of the Pope existing, and although apparently acquiesced in by many who desired a constitution, it is manifest that they were persuaded to this by the belief, founded upon the liberal tendency of the Pope's mind, and he would introduce such reforms as would remove existing abuses in the civil government. So that was their hope, that this Pope, while he was going to maintain his temporal power, and there would not be a constitutional government to replace the Pope's monarchy, that maybe this Pope's going to give us some reforms so we won't be so badly abused as we were under Pope Gregory the 16th. Now it says, with these abuses removed, they possibly hope to become reconciled to the temporal power, at least during the life of Pope Pius IX. The acceptance of the amnesty, therefore, should be considered as the result of a personal trust in him, of the hope that, if not the conviction, that he would introduce such reforms as were required by the public welfare. The popularity of Pope Pius IX was somewhat phenomenal, owing probably to the fact that he had been elected and was accepted as a liberal, and because, moreover, he contrasted most favorably with the harsh, cruel, and despotic Gregory XVI. The people evidently considered a good king, as they expected Pope Pius IX to be, preferable to war, bloodshed, and desolation. It was a choice between two evils. Okay? This is what you get when you make a choice between two evils. Retrogression. Okay? Everybody complains that when they go to the polls in the United States, they're just making a choice between two evils. I think we should take the option that Italy finally took, and we'll see as we continue. Pope Pius IX, although thus recognized as absolute sovereign in Italy, was not the arbiter of his own fortunes. It was an omen of evil for both Christianity and the Church, and here we are with R.W. Thompson regarding the Roman Catholic Church as Christianity, and it is not. It says it was an omen of evil for both Christianity and the Church when the ambition of the Pope led them to unite with political sovereigns and make common cause with them in support of absolute monarchism. The combination necessary to their success became unavoidably such as to require the Pope not merely the recognition of the avowed policy of the sovereigns, which was purely temporal, but that this policy should be engrafted upon the faith of the Church, and obedience to it be exacted by compulsion when not yielded willingly. They wanted to make this a matter of church doctrine, an element of the faith of Roman Catholicism, that monarchy must be preserved, and that the people should obey the king just as they obey the Pope. And this is wherein lies the rub. Okay? The people want their own form of government. They want to have some say in the government. They don't want any more monarchies. And, of course, when they say they don't want any more monarchies, that applies to the papacy, too. So they're at conflict with their church. So the Pope tries to make it a matter of religious faith that they obey the monarchs just as they obey the popes. And it says this was the avowed object of the Holy Alliance, as understood and explained by Prince Metternich of Austria, its great leader and dictator. And when Gregory XVI found it impossible to maintain his temporal power without the military aid of Austria, he committed his pontificate and endeavored to commit the Church by making the temporal policy of the sovereigns part of its faith. Pope Pius IX was compelled to accept the pontificate in the face of these existing facts, and had consequently to contend with two opposing forces, that is, the revolutionary element at home and the sovereigns throughout Europe who demanded that he should continue the retrogressive policy of Pope Gregory XVI. It is therefore but simple justice to his memory to say that while his liberalism made him popular with the masses, he was so hampered, restrained, and tied down by the relations between Pope Gregory XVI and Austria, representing the Holy Alliance, that much of what he afterwards did might possibly have been avoided if he had been permitted to have his own way. Now, R.W. Thompson is trying to give Pope Pius IX the benefit of the doubt. I wonder if his attitude changed after Pope Pius IX wrote his encyclical On Syllabus of Arabs, 1864. Anyway, he says, those who see nothing to disapprove in all the conduct of Pope Pius IX speak of his course at the beginning of his pontificate as noble. This is where he tried to come out as being a liberal, sympathetic with the cause of the people, insofar as he even issued an amnesty. Okay, gave them great hope. False hope as it was, but great hope nonetheless, seeing that the alternative was bloodshed. Now, he was, in some sense, entitled to this praise insofar as he professed a desire for reform, although his reformatory measures were not such as reached the root of the existing evils. Now, what is the root of the existing evils? The divine right of the Pope to rule supreme over both the kings of the world and the people. This is the bedrock of the papacy, is temporal power. Oh, yes, of course, they like to say that he's a successor of Peter, but the throne of Peter, the throne of Peter is easily overturned when the Pope is stripped of his temporal power. So the bedrock of the papacy is the temporal power. And this is what R.W. Thompson has brought out in this book and his previous book, The Papacy and the Civil Power, that we read here on the program. Now it says, but the fact that he was accepted as a reformer in any sense by the people was in itself the cause of serious embarrassment to him, proving how difficult it was to escape the scorching fires which surrounded him. His tendency to reform excited the alarm of Austria, whose emperor saw in it a possible departure from the retrogressive policies of Pope Gregory XVI and the Holy Alliance. Maguire, the historian and earnest defender of the Pope, says that this alarm of Austria was occasioned by the knowledge that, quote, the spirit emanating from the Vatican was kindling a new and dangerous fire in the breast of a downtrodden people, unquote. You see, Benedict XVI had trod down the people, and Austria recognized that, and they recognized that a downtrodden people were the only way that they could maintain their divine right, temporal powers. This is, again, clearly evident in history, what is described in the book of Revelation, or rather the book of Daniel, that the feet mixed with miry clay, the iron feet of Rome treading upon the people. Okay? This is what is described in Revelation chapter 17 as the woman riding the beast, the woman being the church, and the beast being the temporal power. The combination of the papacy and the monarchs and the Jesuits, who together downtread the people. Now it says, where was I? It says, Maguire, an earnest defender of the Pope, says that this alarm of Austria was occasioned by the knowledge that, quote, the spirit emanating from the Vatican was kindling a new and dangerous fire in the breast of the downtrodden people. That is, was kindling afresh the fires of revolution. The plain and obvious meaning of this friendly explanation is that the people of Italy had been and still were oppressed by the policy of the papacy, enforced, as it then was, by the arms of Austria, and that Austria considered that Pope Pius IX, threatening to the cause of monarchism, because it tended to remove this oppression and excite in the minds of the people an increased desire for constitutional government. So you got Prince Metternich and Austria and the Jesuits on one side telling the Pope these concessions to the people is going to backfire on you, and we're all going to lose our power. You must take the stand of Pope Gregory XVI and stamp this revolution out once and for all. Okay? That's how the beast acts. It's an animal. It doesn't care for human beings, and certainly doesn't care for Christ, and it hates his people. And it hates the liberty that comes to those who cherish Christ and adhere to him as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and not the Pope. All right, he gives as the reason for this the fact that Austria was the most formidable enemy of reforms, which she had every reason to dread. Why? Manifestly because reform indicated the possible loss of temporal power by the Pope, which would inevitably prove a serious blow to monarchical power. Why? Because the monarchs get their power from the Pope. Without the Pope, they're nothing in the world. And it says, this would inevitably prove a serious blow to monarchical power and the possible establishment of popular institutions in Italy. In other words, a constitution. He also says that Naples viewed with jealousy the conduct of the Pope, and that some smaller monarchical powers also regarded it with dismay, and in addition that many of the cardinals participated in this alarm of the sovereigns. So the College of Cardinals is split, right? Some are liberal and some are monarchical. Some are totalitarianists or absolutists. And it says, so this Pope Pius IX is in the middle, is caught in the middle and has to make a decision, being forced on one side by these monarchies and the Jesuits and half of the College of Cardinals for absolutism, and the other half, the people, for reform. Now it says Lambruscini, whose election was defeated by the choice of Pope Pius IX, was undoubtedly at the head of this faction in the cardinals, all of whom, says Trollope, were the bitter, rancorous, and irreconcilable enemies of anything that changed or showed a tendency to change anything that existed under the late Pope. Okay? They wanted to go back to the dictatorial days of Pope Gregory XVI. Now, Pius IX was severely tried, and it is not to his discredit, says R.W. Thompson, that he was perplexed. He stood between two imminent and threatening dangers. With Austria supported by the other sovereign powers, a faction of retrogressive cardinals, and the Jesuits upon one side, and the revolutionists upon the other. This Pope Pius IX is between a rock and a really hard place. And when the dust all clears, he's going to side with the monarchists because he is Antichrist. We'll continue with more of the reading of the book Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson when we come back to the break. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio.
$100 days, 100 subscribers at $7 will bring FirstAmendmentRadio.com to the minimum level necessary to sustain it through 2015. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com. $7 a month. Really, you can afford that for our Protestant First Amendment rights and the gospel of the kingdom message. Where your heart is, there will your treasure be also. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Have you seen the Left Behind movies? Have you read the Left Behind fictional book series? Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy. In order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. Because they see the world stage shaping to fulfill what they have been led to believe is sound biblical interpretation, a left-behind rapture scenario, this false view of prophecy is reinforced in the mind, not only of its adherents, but also includes those who have been merely exposed to the specific media. Is it possible that false prophecy can be fulfilled? The rapture theories have always been in dispute. Pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib disputes have risen up in exclusively evangelical circles of recent history, so that when true believers don't suddenly disappear, this element will easily go by the wayside when all see a new Jewish temple begin to be built. Will this be part of the great delusion that will come upon the whole earth? It seems that this great prophetic delusion has already overcome practically the entire American evangelical and Christian world. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. To learn more, visit crosstheborder.org. That's CROSS, crosstheborder.org.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. If you like Inquisition Update, please support it by supporting First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. Now, backing up, going back where we left off before the break, says Pope Pius IX was severely tried, and it is not to his discredit that he was perplexed. He stood between two imminent and threatening dangers. With Austria supported by other sovereign powers, a faction of retrogressive cardinals, and the Jesuits upon one side, and the revolutionists upon the other. The circumstances would have put to a severe test the courage and firmness of a more experienced statesman. In the face of these surroundings, he entered upon a series of reforms, the necessity for which proves how extensive and oppressive had been the misgovernment of his predecessor, and how little liberty the people were permitted to enjoy under him. These had reference to measures of administration and were designed to improve the public service in the hospitals, prisons, and religious institutions. Provision was made for the punishment of fraud and extortion. Don't you suppose that he tried to make that apply to the priests, and how well that worked? He says useful works were encouraged and industry stimulated. Some oppressive taxes were remitted. Companies were authorized to build railroads and to introduce gas. Laymen were allowed to hold some inferior offices. In other words, most of those offices were occupied by priests or those under the control of the priests. It says partial freedom of the press was provided for, and only partial liberty of the press, because if the Pope ever gives free press, the papacy topples, because people begin to read the history of the Roman Catholic Church and the papacy. People begin to read Fox's Book of Martyrs and the hundreds of millions of people that have been slain by the papacy. Papacy is never going to allow full freedom of the press, and especially not in this country. It says partial freedom of the press was provided for, but it was only partial, inasmuch as papal censorship was preserved. In other words, the Pope got to approve or disapprove anything that was written or said in the media. Now it says infant, Sunday, and evening schools were established, and in a public circular he announced that he proposed to assemble a board of counselors to advise with in reference to the administration of public affairs. So he's going to create this interim council that's going to be a buffer between the papacy and the people. Okay? Listen to this. It says the names of these people who were going to sit on this council were to be proposed by the governors of the provinces, and they got their authority from the monarch, right? And the monarch got his authority from the Pope, and it says he was to select, and he, the Pope, was to select the board from the number proposed. So this is just another pretense. Okay? Another false hope. These people are going to be picked by the Pope, just like the Pope picks our presidents in this country. It's just a pretense. Going to the polls to elect a president in the United States is worthless when the papacy picks all the candidates. Okay? So Rome is only doing in this country what she has always done when she picks governors. It's all a pretense. The cards are always stacked against the people and for the papacy. Now it says if all these reforms were necessary, and that they must have been, as indicated in the fact by the fact that they were granted, public affairs were undoubtedly in a most deplorable condition during the pontificate of Pope Gregory XVI. But whether they were or not, a glance at them will show that none of them reached the question which brought on the revolution. They were, in an essential degree, necessary measures of domestic policy, and whatsoever valuable results may have been produced by them, they still left the entire temporal power in the hands of the Pope, so that the people would in the future have nothing to do with making the laws, but would be bound to obey such as the Pope alone should dictate. And in order to make any advance toward constitutional government impossible, the proposed board of counselors were to be practically selected by the Pope. This board was considered by the papal party as a great concession to the people, but it was only relatively so. That is, it was one step, just one step in advance of the old system previously existing. The public were disposed to accept it from the Pope, if not the belief that it would produce beneficial results, and consequently its first meeting was hailed with anxiety. Its probable action was discussed with more freedom than Rome had been accustomed to, and as even the limited freedom of the press had caused a considerable increase in the number of newspapers and a corresponding desire to discuss public questions. The inevitable effect of such a discussion was to invite public attention to the fact which soon became apparent that instead of the Board of Counselors being such a reform as the people had hoped for and expected, its actual meaning was to perpetuate the temporal power of the Pope and to prevent, so long as that existed, the possibility of constitutional government. Whilst matters were in this unsettled condition, Pope Pius IX, unfortunately for himself, was prompted, either at his own or the suggestion of others, to remove all doubt from the subject by informing the Board of Counselors in a speech that he had, quote, not the slightest intention of lessening the power of the pontifical sovereignty, unquote, and that the counselors had nothing to do, quote, beyond giving an opinion when asked to do so, unquote. So this council is just to parrot whatever the Pope says. So much for justice with the papacy, right? The clay cannot negotiate peace with iron. Iron carries all the weight and all the steel, and the clay yield to the iron boot of Rome in every case. All right, this is just another pretense. The papacy can be expected to do this whenever its temporal power is threatened, and the Italian people bought it. And why did they buy it? Because they still recognize the Pope as being the head of their church. Do you know what these Italian people really need to make their revolution successful? They need the Bible, the authorized King James Version of the Bible, in their own language so that they can read it for themselves and discover what the Protestants discover, that the Pope is the man of sin, the son of perdition. He has no spiritual or temporal authority in the body of Christ. And that in the process of rejecting his temporal power, they should also reject his spiritual power and cling to Christ and proclaim their liberty in Christ and defeat the papacy and Austria and monarchism altogether in one blow. And be ready to fight and die for that resolution. Christ and Christ alone. The Scriptures and Scriptures alone. Faith and faith alone. That's what Italy needed to make their revolution successful and to maintain that peace, to kick the papacy out of their hearts and to put Christ in. Knowing this was the case with the Protestants, that they went all the way, not only rejecting the temporal power of the Pope, but also his spiritual power too, and acknowledging him for what the Bible describes him as, the man of sin. Now, to think that once we had come to that liberty in Christ, to now at this day and age wish to unite again with the papacy and the ecumenical movement, it just boggles the mind. What blindness has come over the Protestants of this country. Continuing, he says, at a subsequent time, in a proclamation issued by his Cardinal Secretary of State, he announced that the only progress he proposed to authorize was, quote, within those limits determined by the conditions essential to the sovereignty and the temporal government of the head of the church, unquote. That is the Pope. He says the old issue was thus revived by the Pope himself in such form and with so much directness that everybody understood it. Yes, even a moron could understand the language that this Pope used. I am King of Kings, and I will make no concessions to the contrary. Pope Pius IX intended to maintain his monarchical in Europe into compliance and obedience, but to defeat Protestantism as well. That's what the Jesuit order was created exclusively to do, to destroy Protestantism and the popular form of governments that rose up because of the liberty that they claimed for themselves in Christ. He says discussions of it immediately became common in the public assemblages of Rome. If the extreme revolutionists were able to excite the people by their eloquent and stirring appeals, it was unquestionably owing to the unwise and injudicious avowals of his purposes by the Pope. The Pope wasn't injudicious or unwise. He was simply stating the age-old attitude of the papacy. I am God and there is none else. Pope Pius IX was just being honest. He wasn't being injudicious. He was doing what Antichrist is prophesied to do, to trample the people. He says if he had permitted his administrative reforms to work out their legitimate results, they might have strengthened his cause and that of the papacy. But he failed to do this and thereby increased rather than diminished his own embarrassment. He soon realized the necessity of adopting precautionary measures to suppress a popular tumult in the event that the people could be held in check in no other way. For this purpose, he created a civil guard, which was understood to mean, and in fact was, a military force to be moved against the people whensoever he deemed it expedient. It was in reality a papal army, quote, to consist of every male inhabitant throughout the states of the church between the ages of 21 and 60 who possessed property or kept a shop or was at the head of an industrial establishment, unquote. Okay, so this is conscription from the citizenry of the papal states to form an army in defense of the Pope. The Pope's ready to use more. He's got Austria already standing at the ready with its unchallengeable power, and here he's even conscripting people from the papal states to serve in an army for the eventual subjugation of the people. It says this measure could not be viewed in any other light than as immediate preparation for an aggressive military movement against all who did not submit to the papal policy. In other words, as a contemplated act of war. Looking at it as such, the Pope's Cardinal Secretary of State, who did not favor it, resigned his office, withdrew from the papal service, and left the Pope to the counsel of others. Well, guess who would have stepped right in to counsel the Pope, as if they weren't already, and that is the Jesuits. Now, this conspicuous secession from his cause necessarily produced the most serious results and was mainly influential in exciting all the discontented. Those who had been induced to acquiesce in the measures of the Pope with the hope that they would lead to pacification were then brought to realize that there was no longer any real ground for this hope. On the other hand, they could see nothing in them but what indicated the purpose of the Pope to maintain his temporal power by means of civil war if he should find that necessary. The issue consequently became too distinct and direct to be longer evaded or misunderstood, and from that time, the unification of Italy and the abolition of the temporal power became the watchword of all who desired a constitution, as they soon after became also their battle cry. At a public assemblage to celebrate the birthday of Pope Pius IX, processions of people marching through the streets of Rome prepared tablets with these mottos, among others, upon them. In other words, they were carrying banners and picket signs, right? And on these signs they said, liberty of press, banishment of the Jesuits, abolition of arbitrary action on the part of the police, codes of useful and impartial laws, publication of the acts of the consulta, faith in the people. As a shower of rain prevented the public exhibition of these tablets, they were sent to the Cardinal Secretary of State so that the Pope should be enabled to interpret the mottos upon them and understand their meaning and significance. In every direction, the signs of popular discontent increased. It has been said that Pope Pius IX, that he was vainglorious, which is unquestionably true. Now, I just can't help but comment about this. Vainglory. Does that not describe the papacy, the office of the popes? Vainglory? It's vanity. All of it. It's a pretense. It has no legitimate power or authority, either in spiritual or temporal things. It is Antichrist. And yet the world wonders after this beast called the papacy. The governments of the world respond to his every whim. You talk about vainglory. What a well-chosen word to describe the papacy here by R.W. Thompson. He said, it has been said of Pope Pius IX that he was vainglorious, which is unquestionably true. This quality is not inconsistent with integrity of purpose, but often unfits its possessor for efficacious action in a great crisis. It causes one to rely too much upon personal influence and popularity, as was the case with Pope Pius IX. When he met assemblages of the people, he addressed and bestowed benedictions upon them with apparent self-satisfaction, supposing that their shouts were intended to express unbounded veneration for him, whereas they were the result of respect for his sacred office, which retained many who desired to see the temporal power abolished from openly and publicly avowing it. Those who appealed to and played upon his vanity misled him. Who were these? It is not difficult to tell. They were the Allied sovereigns, who in obedience to the policy of the Holy Alliance had dictated the measures of Gregory XVI and maintained them by the terms of Austria, the retrogressive cardinals, and the Jesuits, the latter, as always, thrusting themselves forward, ready to strike whensoever a blow was needed at the cause of constitutional government. Did you hear that? The Jesuits, as always, thrusting themselves forward, ready to strike whensoever a blow was needed at the cause of constitutional government. Do we have a constitutional government in the United States? We used to have one, but the Jesuits have overthrown it in this country, just like they tried to do in every country they were ever welcome to trespass. You find your Constitution being overthrown? The very first thought that should come to any man's mind when he sees the Constitution of the United States being overthrown is the Jesuits. History has repeated itself so many times that one with a knowledge of history in this country could have predicted the overthrow of our Constitution and by whom it would be overthrown. There's no excuse for anybody in this country not to know who's at the bottom of the overthrow of our Constitution. No excuse. He says this powerful combination was enabled to dictate to the kind-hearted Pope Pius IX, by appeals so artfully made that he became as pliable as wax in their hands. That's what this Pope was, just pliable as wax in the hands of his Jesuit advisors. He says, under their controlling influence, he composed his council of ministers to aid in administrating public affairs, exclusively for ecclesiastics, thereby teaching the people that they could have no part whatsoever in those matters which immediately concerned their temporal welfare. The Pope, led by the Jesuits, insists that the people should have no authority whatsoever in temporal affairs, government. He says, to such an extent was this method of procedure carried that it soon became evident that Italy was, in fact, governed by foreign and alien influences to which the Pope had allowed himself to become entirely subjected. The Pope was being controlled by the Jesuits, who had no love for Italy, no love for the Italian people, and especially no love for the Italian people who wanted to overthrow the monarchical system and impose their own constitutional form of government. And it says, as Austria stood at the head of these influences, the Italian people regarded her with both suspicion and dread. And when the Austrian army was moved into Modena, thereby inducing the belief that the military occupation of the states of the church was intended, the popular indignation became so great that the people demanded of Pope Pius IX that he should declare war against Austria, notwithstanding her immense military strength. The circle of influences surrounding him was now growing more and more complicated, evidently adding to his embarrassment. He knew that he was under the suspicion of Austria because of his former tendency toward liberalism at the beginning of his pontificate, but could not venture to break his alliance with her, being assured, if he did, that it would lead to movements elsewhere in the Italian states that would shake the papacy to its center and inevitably cost him the loss of his temporal power, which he dreaded more than all else. These complications created others, which added to the uncertainties of the future. Under the existing emergencies, a skillful statesman would have found a broad field for the display of ability in escaping the pitfalls before him. But Pope Pius IX was not a statesman in any sense, and knew but little of public affairs as they existed in the Italian provinces, except that what centered in the papacy, and nothing of international relations, except that as Pope he was tied to the car of the reigning sovereigns and was compelled, nolens volens, in other words, whether he liked it or not, to share their fortunes. If he had possessed broad and comprehensive views, sufficient to enable him to see beyond the narrow circle in which he was moving, he might have realized that whilst the people of Italy were willing and anxious to award him full credit for such reforms as he had introduced, they fell far short of the popular desire because they did not reach the evils complained of, that is, the Pope's temporal power. We've run out of time and breath, and we'll be back on Inquisition Update tomorrow to continue our reading and discussion of the book, The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. I'll see you tomorrow.
Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.